What's up guys, Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to install the full King coilover and rear shock setup on your F150, so let's get right into it. So obviously step one is going to be getting your truck up in the air on jack stands or on a lift, and then you're going to want to pull your wheels off so that way you have full access to the suspension. So once all that's out of the way, the next thing we want to do is get as much slack as we can in these brake and ABS lines. So we're going to take a 10mm socket as well as a 5/16, loosen up these two brackets, and then I also like to pull out some of these plastic clips just to give us enough space to really, release the tension in those lines. So we've got a bunch of play in our lines now, which is good. And I also went behind the knuckle and disconnected the vacuum line for the IWEs. So we'll want to make sure we reconnect that at the end, but that's just going to give us a little bit more room to play with. Now down here, we're going to want to take off this dust cap and loosen up our axle nut. And with the dust cap, on a newer truck, it's not too hard to get off. Usually some vice grips or channel locks will kind of wiggle this free. If it's on there a little tighter, you may need to tap with a mallet or something to get some tension released, but we're just going to clamp on right here and give this a little wiggle. There we go. Now for the axle nut itself, we're going to take a 13mm socket with an extension here, and I'm going to loosen it up, but I'm not going to take it all the way off just yet. Now this step is somewhat optional, but I like to do it early on because it helps. I'm going to loosen up the nuts on the ends of these upper control arm frame mounts, so that way we take some of the tension off the upper arm, and then when we loosen this, we'll be able to move it a bit more freely without it just spring loaded and shooting back out. So I'm going to get the wrench back in here. Now I'm going to take this deep well 18mm socket and a breaker bar, and we're going to loosen up the nut for the ball joint on the upper control arm. After breaking the nut free, sometimes it's easier to go back with a socket to hold the end of the actual ball joint stud there, and then you can use a wrench to turn this so that way you're not just infinitely spinning it around without it coming free. And we're just going to loosen it down to the last couple threads so it holds together, and then we'll come back to this in a minute. There we go. And it's worth mentioning too, since our truck's a little bit newer, this wasn't really bound up in the knuckle, but sometimes over time when there's dirt and mud and heat, this will get locked up. You'll just need to give it a couple hits with a hammer right here on the end of the knuckle. Don't hit the arm or the ball joint and it should pop loose for you. Now we're going to grab our breaker bar again and a deep well 21mm socket, and we're going to come over to the tie rod end and we're going to loosen up this nut on the bottom so we can get this free from the actual knuckle. Now once again, it's worth pointing out, this truck's pretty new, so this came free real easily as soon as I broke the nut free, but if yours is bound up in the knuckle, you're gonna wanna tap here with a hammer again, right on the end, and you wanna just make sure that you're not hitting the end of the ball joint or the actual stud that's coming through. Now tucked back here in the wheel well, you'll see your sway bar coming through, which has an end link that goes down into your lower control arm. So underneath that lower control arm, we're going to use an 18mm deep well again to get underneath, remove that nut, and that's going to give us some play in the end of the sway bar. We've got almost everything clear now, so I'm going to come back down and remove this axle nut the rest of the way so it's completely free. And then we're also going to remove the nut for the upper control arm, and then we can get this all popped up and kind of move the knuckle out of the way, and that's going to give us the access we need for the coilover. So now with everything open and clear, we can get up to the top of our strut, and we're going to want to remove these three nuts that are securing that top hat. These are 18s at the top, and you might have to get a little bit creative because space can be tight. So if you can get a socket on here, twist them free. The back one you may have to kind of work with a wrench, but once those are off, we'll move to the bottom. At the bottom, we're going to use our 18mm deep well to get around those studs and loosen up those two nuts. Make sure you save these 2 nuts because you're going to need them again when we put the king in. With all the nuts taken off the top and bottom mounts, now we can work the strut all the way out, and you're gonna have to just put some pressure on your lower control arm to get everything free, kind of wiggle this out of the way, and then we can work on getting the king in. So here's the new coilover, and it's worth noting that there is a right and a left side, so make sure you choose the correct one. Pretty much what's going to determine it is how they have that top hat set up and where this reservoir hose is going to come out, because you need the reservoir to be towards the front of the truck, where that bracket's going to mount basically by your tow hooks. And so this next part is possibly the most tricky part of this install, and you're probably going to want a friend. So you can have one person hold the coilover itself, and then the other person can run the reservoir up through that top shock tower and around to the front of the vehicle. Through. Down, let's go up. With the new coilover in place, you're gonna have some hardware in your bag with some little bolts and washers here for the top. We're gonna go ahead and thread these into the top hat by hand because you don't wanna cross thread this or else you're gonna be in a real bad way. And you may just have to kind of rotate the coilover a little bit as you do it to get the holes lined up. We're gonna get it in tight enough to kind of hold it in place, and then we'll do the bottom before we go back and retighten everything all the way down. For the bottom mount, Kings is going to provide you with 2 of these lag bolts and some washers. We're going to drop these in from the top, and then you're going to reuse those nuts that we took off from the factory strut. With everything in loosely, we just need to go in and tighten it all back down all the way using a 9/16 socket at the top and then that 18mm deep well on the bottom to get those nuts locked in. I've got everything tightened up now, and it's worth noting that King does provide some of the torque specs you need in your instruction manual, so make sure you go back and check those. Anything that doesn't have a torque spec is going to go back to factory. What I typically do is install everything first, and then I go back at the end and retorque it just as a double check to make sure that I got everything and that it is to spec. Next thing we want to do is move this knuckle back up into position, make sure our axle is seating properly through the bottom, and then we're going to reattach the upper control arm to hold this all together, and we can continue with the reassembly. Quick note, make sure you don't over tighten that axle nut because you can do some real damage if you do, so just be careful. If you did the optional step earlier of loosening these mounts for the upper control arm, make sure you go back and tighten those now. Now we can reattach our tie rod end to the knuckle and our sway bar end link to that lower control arm. With the tie rod end and the sway bar tightened up, now we can go back and reattach all of our lines and brackets here to the knuckle and this shock tower at the back. One thing you want to make sure you don't forget when you're reattaching your lines is to come back in here behind that knuckle, and you're going to grab this vacuum line and reattach it to these ports, just like so. After you've gone through and made sure everything is torqued to spec and tight and you're happy with how it's all put together, you do want to put this little dust cover back on over your axle nut. So we'll push him into place and just give it a few taps. Now that we're at the end, the very last thing we have to do is mount our bracket for the remote reservoir. And the brackets are side specific, they're marked left and right, so make sure that you have the proper one. And it's basically gonna fit up here and attach to the tow hooks. And for those of you with a 4-wheel drive truck, this won't be a huge issue. You'll have tow hooks up front and you're just gonna need to remove this to attach the bracket. Those of you that have 2-wheel drive trucks are gonna have to follow along with King's instructions, and you're actually gonna need to pull your front bumper off to get the space you need to get the bracket mounted, and you're gonna have to use some hardware that they include. So that's kind of a whole different ball game, but we're gonna focus on a 4-wheel drive one here. Then another thing to note for those of you that have a 4-wheel drive truck that's maybe a bit newer, you may have a kind of rubber or plastic air dam here that fills the void around the tow hook for fuel economy, and that's gonna need to come off. Now, technically you can remove your whole front bumper to get that free. It is a lot of work. The other thing you can do is cut out the bottom of that plastic so you can get to the screws for the tow hook, pull the tow hook out, and then you can actually pry this out from underneath without having to remove the entire bumper. If you are concerned about cutting that air dam up, that might not be the option for you, but they're really not that important, and we needed the fastest way to get in here, so we cut ours out. Now, with all that being said, we've got access to the tow hook. We're gonna need a 15mm socket to work these factory bolts loose, and once we get this free, we can get our new mount put in. Be careful as you're loosening this up. You'll notice that the bracket that these bolts are going into just kind of sits freely in the frame, so you don't want to lose it too far back, but there is a hole where you can get your finger or a screwdriver in here to hold it and push it forward. So I do kind of use that to stabilize it, but we're going to pull this all the way out first, and then we'll get the bracket. All right, as you can see, I've got the thread started on those bolts. We have the bracket kind of sandwiched in between the head of the bolt and the actual tow hook underneath. So now when we tighten this up, it's gonna push that bracket up against the frame, and we'll have somewhere to mount that reservoir. The reservoirs mount to the bracket using hose clamps, but I will warn you guys that the hose clamps King provides are really, really small and they barely fit around that resi. So I highly recommend buying some longer ones. It just makes your life a lot easier, and there's a lot less chance of these rattling loose and coming off, which will allow your resi to just slap around under the truck. So we got some longer ones. We're gonna thread them on here and we should be good. So guys, that's going to be a wrap on the front coilovers for the King kit, but now we need to go around to the back and get our rear shocks put on. Thankfully, removing the rear shocks on the F150 is pretty simple. You're just going to have a nut and a bolt in this top mount and one in the bottom, and it's usually easier to start from the bottom, swing the shock out, then do the top, and then we'll work on getting the new one in. So I've got our new King shock here, and you do want to be careful because these are side specific for the rear, and they're labeled, so when you grab it, make sure you're doing your right on your right side, left on the left. And if you have it positioned right, you should have your reservoirs pointed towards the back of the truck. Now, with that being said, we're going to start by mounting the top first, and then we'll push the shaft up and get the bottom into place. again, as with the fronts, once you're done, make sure you go back and torque these to factory spec. And after that, it's going to be a wrap on this king suspension. One last thing you need to make sure you do is have your truck professionally aligned after you get it put back on the ground, because you don't want any sort of weird tire wear issues or have it tracking funny on the road. Now, with that being said, if you guys are interested in picking up a king suspension system for your F-150, you can head down in the description below, click those links. It's going to shoot you over to our website, and I'll see you guys next time.